Welcome to Goalie Science, the podcast that bridges the gap between goaltending, science, and peak performance. I'm your host, Jamie Phillips, a former professional goalie, currently pursuing a doctorate in physical therapy and specializing in goalie performance coaching. Joining me as always is Dr. Ben Cernick, a seasoned goalie coach and sports analytics specialist. Whether you find yourself at home, on the road, or at the rink, grab a cup of your favorite beverage and let's drop the puck on this week's episode. All right, today we are fortunate enough to be joined by Dr. Rob Gray, who I am going to completely allow to introduce himself. So, Dr. Gray, can you please do us all the pleasure and introduce yourself to the listeners so they know who we're speaking with today?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I'm Rob Gray. My main job is I'm a professor at Arizona State University. I study a variety of things. Mostly recently, I study kind of skill acquisition, how people learn, motor learning, kind of improve skills. I've applied that for many years in working with different Olympic sports, including hockey. A lot of what I do is baseball. My main kind of side gig now is I work with the Boston Red Sox, is helping them with practice design and training. Also relevant to this, I am Canadian. I'm from Toronto, and I grew up playing hockey. I was a hockey goaltender for many, many years. I played up until college, so I miss it sometimes, but you don't get much hockey down here in Arizona. So, so that's my background.
Yeah, so we're super fortunate to be joined today because this is something near and dear to my heart. Everyone listening who knows, who puts up with me constantly talking about the research that we do in my lab and the stuff that I look at in the science approach to practice design and skill acquisition knows or is going to be in for a special treat, because a lot of the stuff that I spout is actually just regurgitating what Dr. Gray says. But again, like I said, like we kind of talked about before in the show, we talk a lot about practice design and how practice isn't always the most favorable to hockey goalies. It's not always designed with goalies in interest. We see kind of the same issues in soccer. So I was just kind of curious to not specifically ask about the problem for practice design with goalies, but in just a general sense, what are some of the common classic pitfalls of motor learning design issues in team sports? So things that we see in hockey, even to some degree, obviously in baseball and soccer, any of those team sports where you find, again, common pitfalls in standard or typical practice design that you see?
Yeah, I guess the biggest one is, we're starting to change our view of what's the best way to learn skills from, for a long time, we've had this kind of very traditional approach that the coach tells you the way to do something. Here is the way you do a slap shot. Here is the way you do a butterfly. Then you repeat that over and over and over again until you get it down. You can do it automatically. We've kind of more and more realized, there's not just one way to do things. There's depends on the individual. It's much better if you kind of let people learn on their own, and you can't repeat the same. Don't make the same butterfly save every time. There's people in front of you, shots from different angles, so you need multiple different movement solutions or ways to stop the puck. So it's better to allow your athletes to become adaptable instead of just learning the one correct way you think to do things. So that's kind of the movement that's happening in a lot of different sports.
Yeah, and I know that the one big challenge, and again, so myself and my co-host Jamie, whoever listening knows, discuss a lot that in like a one-on-one coaching setting, and what we see a lot is our parents are they always want to see the engagement from coaches, right? They want to see that constant correction, want to see, and I know that's the number one piece of pushback that you've talked about a lot in the past on your show and some of your research as well, that letting, again, self-organize, letting athletes, letting goalies kind of do things and figure them out and figure out their own movement solutions on their own doesn't always look like coaching is happening, right? You say that is one of the most common things that practitioners or coaches struggle with is, well, I want to let the kids figure it out, but the parents are going to yell at me for doing nothing.
Yeah, you do get it a lot. I've had that happen to me too. When are you going to start coaching? People kind of have this view that a good practice is everybody's organized, standing in lines, waiting to do their turn. Everything's very orderly. Letting things kind of go chaotic and like playing a small-sided 2-on-3 game and stuff doesn't look as like the coach is controlling things, which is part of the whole point, right? Part of the point in this approach is letting the practice do the talking for you rather than trying to control everything that everybody is doing all the time as a coach. So it's letting go a lot of the control as a coach. Yeah. You do have to kind of prime people for that, how that's going to look. Yeah.
Yeah, I spend a lot of my time doing that with parents is, hey, like I know your kid was diving around a little bit more maybe than you're comfortable with, but there's, your kid is 8, and I think that's important that they learn to try different things because again, they're 8 years old and 3 feet tall. So they're not quite adult sized yet. Which I think kind of ties into one of the big topics of conversation that's I kind of mentioned this before the show that's been really popular in Canada is recently Hockey Canada, following trend of other countries, has changed minor hockey, so under the age of 9, to half ice hockey. Which again, I've spoken about this before in the show. I'm a big fan of. I think when we think of just how many more chances players get to touch the puck and skate with the puck and move it, and goalies, even young goalies who get their turn in net when they're rotating through, they get even more shots because the game is just faster compared to that full ice. But we've seen a decent amount of pushback against this because it looks a-traditional. I was kind of hoping if you could kind of just touch on from, again, your experience, and you already mentioned small-sided games, but also how other sports have adopted different types of scaling and what that looks like and why that's important.
Yeah, so the kind of the way that we want to we recognize with young athletes or new athletes, we need to simplify the game a little bit. There's too much going on usually. So the way that we want to do is you're right, the term we use is scaling. Let's reduce everything down instead of the more traditional way of breaking it apart, having you stick handle around cone instead of facing another player. So yeah, it's reducing the space in small sizes or sometimes called conditioned games. I think that's very, very effective. And there's other sports when they do that with equipment, right? There's some great research on tennis, for example, when you let kids play with smaller rackets and lower compression balls that don't bounce as high. They learn to play tennis much more effectively, and it smoothly transfers into adult equipment and easily without. I think that's the problem. Most people would worry about half-size hockey. As soon as you put them on the full rink, they'll be lost.
Right.
But it seems to it seems to transfer quite well, actually. But you're right. It's just going to give them more chances to interact with other players, experience spacing, all the things that's going to be the same when they're on the full ice, right? And probably wear them out less, right? That's skate less, cover less room. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more chance for learning. I think you're right. That's the biggest pushback is that people think it's not going to transfer or it doesn't look like the type of sport that they know. Right. Hockey's been kind of slow adopting it. I think for years now, right? You mentioned tennis, but basketball, we don't hand a full-size adult basketball to a 7-year-old and ask them to shoot on a 10-foot net because it's going to be pretty not only discouraging, but it again is going to essentially the motor patterns that they're going to learn and explore are going to look a lot different at that age and that size compared to what ideally you would hope it would transfer to as they mature.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had a funny conversation with a coach of I think an under-8 team a few months ago, and some of the rules for this half-ice hockey include using smaller nets, which I think is great. As a goalie coach, having a scaled size net so that as kids get bigger, they still cover the same percentage of net. I think it's a wonderful learning tool. People don't always love that, and that's okay. But I had a coach tell me that they didn't like the small nets because the goalies would just lay down and the kids couldn't raise the puck. And I thought that was hilarious, right? Like a tiny 7-year-old goalie just lying down. Classic what you imagine. Then I found out that the 7-year-olds were using the full weighted puck, so the adult puck.
Right.
Which, again, if we're thinking about that learning example, of course the goalie's just going to lay down, right? We've missed the mark on a part of that scaling adjustment, right? So you had mentioned the different compression in tennis balls, right? It makes sense just to use a lighter puck as well for a kid who weighs 35 pounds.
For sure. And part of the challenge, mentioned another kind of challenge is, when you do these kind of, we call it constraints, manipulations, the size of the puck, the number of players, and sometimes you can get, players will cheat and shortcut what you're trying to achieve. I've had that happen where, I make rule that you have to pass 3 times before you shoot, and they just stand at the top, pass back and forth 3 times, then go play. So you have to get creative and go around those things for sure. But yeah, no, I think that's a good example of, it brings up an important concept we call representative design. Really, we want a few key pieces there in practice. Like, you want information. Are you still handling the puck in response to another player? Are you still using the same kind of movements? Those kind of things. As long as things are there, then we're okay with reducing less players, less size. That seems to transfer very well.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue because you have this wonderful video that I have posted to our followers a number of times, which is a kind of a presentation on YouTube about representative learning in hockey goaltending training. So I remember watching that when that first came out and sharing it with lots of people, trying to get people to experience that. But you talk about representative design in goalie training, and it's something that's really difficult. So, for example, I know that in a lot of private coaching settings, there's maybe one coach and maybe another shooter who might be helping out, but then one goalie. There's no defense. There's none of the kind of external variables that we see. And that's kind of the traditional sense of goalie training. It's the sense that I operate within when I'm working day to day with goalies. Now, obviously, in that setting, you're not going to create a perfect representative design. There won't be 5-on-5. There's not the chaos. There's not the refs, the fans, the whistles, and everything in between. So trying to make that training approach as transferable, and transfer being the biggest goal, right? What we learn actually transfers to how we would execute it from practice to game. But I guess kind of the question there is, what are, in your opinion, kind of the steps when you are in those more private settings and that is what you have to work with? What do you think are the steps there that can benefit goalies and I guess coaches to the same degree? Like, how do they make that more representative for better transfer?
Yeah, there's kind of two. When I work with a lot of coaches, there's a resistance. They've been doing the same way for a long time. And I always start with variability. Adding a little bit variability to practice is beneficial in so many ways. So not doing saving the same exact shot over and over. I did some work with some NBA teams this past fall. And I went out to their practice and the guys were shooting threes. And when there's no one around them, their percentage is like 90%. They can hit every shot because they're doing the same shot over and over and over, right? Can we make them slightly different angles, someone in their face sometimes? So I think the same principle. Can we add a little variability to the shots you're giving them to save from the angles and distances, it's someone in front of them? And then can we make it a little more game-like, like consequences for the rebounds, right? When you give a big fat rebound, can you have someone stand there, you're going to put it back in? Things like that. So those are the two things I kind of stress initially, get people to, can we add that, a little bit of that to what you're already doing to get people into it? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly, again, now I say that's exactly what I've been trying to do, mainly because I've already listened to you speak on that. So I sound great right now because this is the same things that I preach. But yeah, that's one of the biggest changes that I know that I made in my personal coaching journey and my personal coaching experience is, as yourself as a goalie who's done goalie training, and what you commonly see is it's all right, you're going to go from point A to point B. You're going to get this type of shot. You're then going to go to point C, come back to B, and get this type of shot. And goalies look incredible in those drills.
Yes.
Were they really good? It's just no different than saying, okay, you're going to get an 80-mile-per-hour fastball, middle in, and you can hit it 480 feet up.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
And
yeah.
So I think, variability has been, I think, one of the biggest things that I've tried to stress in my own training and I think, or my coaching. And I think that's been really beneficial, right? And like you mentioned there, sometimes it's just not starting from the same spot every time, or the shot, or just moving 5 feet to the left, 5 feet to the right, 5 feet in, just so that it's not the same learning experience every single time, right?
Yeah, for sure. A little bit of unpredictability. It doesn't have to be the full scale, like every possible shot that could happen, but a little bit more than doing the same thing over and over, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's what, like I said, what I've been trying to implement myself. But I think that is sometimes easier said than done. And like you said, coaches have experience creating results, right? If you're a coach who's been coaching for 30 years and you have, a dozen goalies who have made the NHL, it's going to be pretty hard to get someone to change their ways because they think they've created that recipe that works. And it's, I think, not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with the original way of that coaching, but rather that it's maybe not as optimized as it could be. Is that?
Yeah, maybe? For sure. Like I always stress, the methods work. Like almost anything works. We're kind of learning machines. This is kind of more efficient use of practice time, I think, optimized. The other thing I didn't mention, so I think, looking good in practice is something in motor learning. That's performing. That's not really learning. So I really stress, and you have to tell the players this and their parents. You learn when you fail. So you need some shots you go in when you're practicing, right? If you're saving everything, you're not improving, right? That's what you want to do in the game. You want to perform in the game, but to put a push you and challenge you, we need to have some shots that you miss and things like that. So getting that level of challenge, that kind of failure is important. We don't want you to fail all the time. You're right. You're going to dishearten and dismotivate, but at least kind of 20%, 25%, we should push.
And that's exactly what we call it. We call it the 80, again,
Yeah.
myself and Jamie call it the 80-20 rule, right? Like you
Yeah.
want, especially there's certain situations, there's harder plays or more common mistakes in goaltending, right? So a goalie being a little bit out of position as a player moves laterally across the ice, that's a super common scenario. And if a younger goalie is making that mistake often, you have to score on them. Like as a coach,
Yeah.
that's the chance you score on them because that creates that learning opportunity, right? They can identify the mistake, or if they're, younger and newer, that's coaching opportunity to go in there and provide that feedback, right?
Yeah.
I think going back to some of it, again, like the discussion around ecological and dynamics and allowing kids to self-learn that process and self-learning, I think people misinterpret that as saying that coaches shouldn't provide feedback.
Yeah.
I think is a bit of maybe a straw man, or maybe just an incorrect understanding of the approach, right? It's not like if a kid's repeating the same mistake, coaches are just standing there and going, we'll just let them hold their stick entirely wrong at the bottom the entire time, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is a big misconception, is that it's just letting them play, do whatever. You're right. You do want to, as a coach, step in. Sometimes it's instruction. Sometimes it's adding another type of constraint or something. You see something that is not going to be effective, they're not doing well, definitely you want to step in and use your knowledge to. The kind of thing we really don't like is doing that right from the start, right? Where we've got to explain all the things. Here's how you do a proper forehand, and that put your foot here, and But if you see something that's not effective, can we think of something that will move the person in that direction?
Yeah, exactly. We just know the company that I work with, we just wrapped up like an 8-week beginner session with 6, 7, and 8-year-old goalies, which is really fun because they're little sponges and they also just kind of flop around truthfully a lot, which is, it's funny. Again, as a coach, and again, it was for me, it was both challenging and exciting because again, kind of this was the first time that we had done this in a little while. So I got a bit of a refreshed approach to just kind of let them do a lot of their own learning, right? Like, here, I'm gonna create this environment for the drill. We included a little bit of variability, which again, for them, there's still something we're still learning to skate a little bit. So there's so many, again, their challenge point or their difficulty in each drill and each task was harder than an older goalie.
For sure.
But it was fun to see again how much of it was just, instead of I want you to hold your stick this way and this save, it's I want you to try and save it with your stick, right? Trying to reframe the perspective of that. That was hard for me because sometimes you watch it and it's like, that looks awful. At least to what I think is supposed to look really good. But then you take a step back and you're like, that's a 7-year-old or that's an 8-year-old, right? Like they're supposed to, they shouldn't look good. They're not, 6 foot tall, 175-pound adults. It shouldn't look the same, right? So I think that's hard. I think that's hard for people to kind of understand as well sometimes, that it's okay if it doesn't look the way that you see on TV.
Yeah, for sure. I think we get stuck with a certain model in our head of how things should look, and then you look at all the great and they don't look that way all the time, right? So it's kind of misleading, and sometimes,
Yeah, and the thing again, like we talked kind of a little bit about variation before, but there's going to be natural variation between performers in general, at the highest levels, right? I think it's again it's easy to look at goalies and say, well, goalies physically don't look the same as each other. They don't play the same way as each other. I think an even easier one in pulling from baseball is looking at the different types of windups that we see in baseball pitchers, right? Like how rarely they all share similar characteristics for their angles, but the process is entirely different for a lot of players, right?
For sure. Yeah, we kind of, we recognize there's some things that kind of have to be there, but beyond that, there's lots of different ways to achieve the same thing across a lot of different athletes. Yes, for sure. We want to allow for that. A lot of those differences are due to your differences, body dimensions, flexibility, whatever. So we want to let you kind of find your own thing that works for you. We think that in the long run, that's going to be best.
Yeah, and that's very much where I was fortunate enough in my undergraduate degree where I got that instilled in me so earlier.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. I always say this. So I work with Dr. Nick Waddy at Ontario Tech University.
Okay.
So he was he was a supervisor in my research, but he also was my undergraduate sports psych professor. So this was always something that was kind of ingrained into me, I guess, earlier on in my coaching journey, which was, we have end goals, but we have processes, and self-learning and self-organization is so valuable. That you don't want to take the creativity out of people too early, right? Let them solve themselves.
I think so. I think you kind of want to teach them the main overall kind of principles and things rather than. I always talk about one of when I was a young goalie, the drill my coach gave me once was, he had shooters all around and circle around, and he said, all you can do is go out and cut down the angle. You're not allowed to move at all to stop the shot. You can't try to block. You can't move your stick, your body. And basically, he was trying to show me how many people missed or hit me the puck if you cut down the angle properly, which I did. I learned it was amazing. You just let the practice environment show me that, rather than telling me you need to be here than there. I always remember that drill. It was a very powerful one. So yeah, letting those things happen.
It's funny. I was telling that story to one of my goalies, and I flipped the script entirely on them about a month ago, where I said, I'm going to make you, in this drill, it's a team practice, I'm going to make you stand on your goal line the entire drill.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to see how much you need to move your arms to make saves. And again, he's a under 18 goalie, so he's 17, and realized pretty quickly that it wasn't actually that much. And so I had found that he'd been making kind of this overreaching mistake. He was overreaching for pucks, things hitting him awkwardly. Again, okay, now you're at the deepest you can be. How far do you really need to reach, right? And I found, and I guess what this comes down to for people listening is like, these are ideas of constraints, right? Which you mentioned before. And that is the approach I use for coaching, which is a constraints-led approach. And so while we have talked about it, could you give me your best, this is the time to shine the best technical and academic explanation for constraints-led approach? And then I guess what that means practically, right? Because I think both are interesting and relevant.
Sure. So a constraint, basically it starts with the idea, there's lots of different, you think of like in my sport, hitting a baseball. There's literally an infinite number of ways I could swing a bat to hit a baseball. And there's famous researcher Nikolai Bernstein called this the degrees of freedom problem. There's too many options. How do you pick? And the reason we call it sounds funny because constraint sounds like we tie you up or something. Right? A constraint is something that gets rid of one of the solutions, right? So it's not going to, if I throw a ball at 100 miles an hour, there's a lot of solutions that are going to fall away. They're not going to work anymore. You're not going to get the bat as quickly. So the constraint-led approach is adding something to practice, a new constraint or changing a constraint to kind of guide someone to a particular solution or get them to explore different solutions. So the number of players, the size of the playing area are all constraints, rules, equipment, so there's a lot of different ones you can be really creative with, but that's the basic approach. So getting kind of using these things in the practice environment to kind of change how the person is moving rather than as much as possible avoiding telling them, oh, you need to get down on your knees there, like that's what we're trying to move away from a little bit. For lots of reasons. We know that's not effective.
Yeah, the example in hockey I always say is a constraint for team coaches is I say, imagine a drill where a player just can't make a pass or a shot with their backhand. They have to, right? Because what I'm saying, or receive a pass on their backhand, what I'm saying is they need to move their body open and change their hip angles and their knee angles to only use their forehand, right? Now, again, naturally, first time I ever said that, player looked at me and goes, but I use my backhand in the game. This is stupid. And I said, okay, thank you. I promise there's an explanation here. But again, that is the common response a lot of the time, right? So like, why? Right. But the point is, again, like you said, you're modifying something to encourage something else without giving away what you're trying to do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're trying to get you to try something different and explore and stuff. You're right. And often this is where people because constraints are often going to be very different than the game, right? But we're doing it for a purpose. Like we're not just picking randomly. You didn't just pick that rule out of a hat, right? There was a reason you wanted to encourage certain behavior.
Right.
And
Exactly. Yeah. And then in my situation there is the team I was working with at the time, we had the very large issue of just missing backhand passes when they could have just taken the puck on their forehand. Now, should they develop the skill to receive a backhand pass? Absolutely. 100%. That's an important skill to be able to do. But at the same time, it's them acknowledging what's going to be more successful in the long run. And if we know that all it takes is opening up to receive a pass on your forehand is more beneficial long-term, well, we should encourage that too. And also encourage the skill development of being able to receive a pass on the back.
Yeah.
Right? Both can be true. Right? You can constrain around both situations.
For sure.
Encourage learning for both. Now, and again, and I know this is, I'm still one of your examples that you use, talk about by using different like bat sizes and bat weight sizes, even ball weights and ball sizes for pitchers as kind of examples of constraints. Do you see that broader concept does that need to be introduced only at a later stage of development and maturation for athletes, or do you see a place for that for younger athletes? Now, again, aside, we talked about like the small pucks or age appropriate basketballs, but let's say those kind of like teenagers who are in that in between phase. Do you think you can kind of add those equipment manipulations continually throughout the development process?
I think so. I like to think of it, you're just giving the athlete a new problem to solve. Here's a heavier or bigger ball, throw a strike with it, right? Or get on them. There is some, I face a lot of hesitation because, heavier and young kid sounds like injury, right? That's in automatic injury to a lot of people. But there's nothing special about 5 ounces or 6 ounces that makes it injured. They're just as likely to get injured. So obviously you need to be careful and think about how, the key for me is that I really like to kind of mix it, and I don't want to have like a progressive 5, then 6, then 8, then 10. I think that's where you can get into injury problems where people are just trying to throw things harder and harder and going up. I'd rather mix things in. That's kind of the rule, kind of randomly and variably. But yeah, I think so. I think that could be beneficial. We always talk about kind of scaling it to their age and their skill level. If they're people, younger athletes bring a lot of their own, like you said with the kid, that young goal, they bring a lot of their own variability to the ice, right? So you don't need to add as much to as a coach with your practice. But as they get more and more advanced, for sure, I think they could be beneficial.
Yeah, and that kind of like mirrors the way that I look at it and the way that I view it as well. I think with the younger athletes, I think a lot of environmental constraints will allow for those self-organization opportunities. Right? You just change, okay, you have to, you have a smaller size area of ice or pitch or a smaller field. Or even, again, just change the number of people, right? 2 versus 3, 4 versus 2, all these different situations that forces different styles of learning. I think hockey, though sometimes a slow adapting sport, unintentionally does those constraints without really acknowledging, or realizing that they're doing them. I think of all the 2 versus 3, 3 versus 3 small area games that I did growing up in the mid 2000s, and people didn't really refer to them as small area games. They're just battle drills, right? We're just battling. Like little did, or maybe they didn't quite appreciate that. Actually, you're forcing them to view and respond differently, right? Teach them different skills, right side of the puck, right position, where to go that way. So I think in some ways it's been used without people fully appreciating maybe the science or the theory behind it even.
Yeah, I think so. And what I always like to point out, like I grew up playing road hockey, obviously, as a kid. And we do that. We do it naturally all the time, right? One of the goalies is missing. Okay, turn the net around or lay it on the ground. Or we have one player way better. Oh, you're not allowed to take slap shots. Like we make our own constraints all the time, right? To balance things out. And so kids are used to this, we just kind of lose it somewhere along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just we try to make them little professionals too quickly sometimes, or even think maybe that professionals don't do this sort of work, even though they do.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. A lot of times a lot of the sports I've seen, it happens separately from like in baseball, there's kind of private training facilities where people do these weighted ball things. And part of it is the failure, right? But you don't want to look bad in front of your teammates and people watching you in the stands. But yeah, a lot of it is going on for sure and across a lot of sports, I think.
Yeah, and again, at the professional level, when the difference between being a star performer or a middle performer is so small, right? The difference between abilities between these athletes is right. It's again, you have to get creative. Now, again, for people listening, this idea of power law of practice, and the more practice you accumulate, and the better type of practice that you accumulate over a certain amount of time, it's diminishing returns, right? If you practice 8,000 of incredibly focused hours, the next 1,000 are probably a lot less valuable than the first 1,000. That's right. So it's that's where this extra motor learning or these extra creative ways of learning might be a difference, especially if maybe they haven't been introduced to that type of practice before as well. Because we know everyone has different practice histories. Not everyone, some people may have been introduced to a constraints-led approach from an early age, or they've been through structured blocked practice for 15 years, and that's all they've ever known. Yeah. Right. So again, you mentioned variability in drills, but variability in training in general probably has the ability to improve skill acquisition and motor learning over longer periods of time as well. Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's more research. You get more kind of bang for your buck, the same amount of practice. And there's some really interesting research showing it's also related to injury, right? doing the exact same butterfly as a goalie, put the same stress on your knee tendons, for example, versus doing slightly different one because you have to stop pucks from slightly different angle. You're not doing it exactly the same way every time. You're reducing kind of the stress on your. So there's research showing they can be beneficial for kind of markers of ACL injury and things like that as well.
Yeah, it's, again,
And long performance benefits. Yeah.
right. So again, we're starting to see kind of those benefits across the major domains I think we all care about, which is health and then performance, right?
Yeah.
So switching a little bit of a lens here. There's something that kind of has, again, another trend that's taken over the goalie world is the introduction of VR training. So this idea of, I'm a goalie. I know that the best way to train is probably on the ice where I'm going to have, again, closer to the most representative design. But we also know that maybe we don't have access to ice. We don't have access to training. So a lot of people are kind of turned to this idea of VR. And even in some instances, replacing some of what their more standard training would look like with this idea of VR. Now, I know specifically in hockey goalies, I get asked this multiple times a week. We don't have a large, substantial base of empirical evidence that has examined the impact of VR training on ice hockey goalies. But there's been, over the past couple of decades, VR in soccer and VR in handball, or at least big screens and computer augmented reality. And you've done some work and some writing on this topic. So I was kind of hoping you could just do a little bit of an explanation and kind of exploratory detail around that sort of line, some pros, maybe some cons, what you're seeing.
Yeah, I've always had a little maybe different than a lot of people. Like, I think VR can be very useful as a value added to real practice, right? It can be. I don't think putting this effort trying to replace everything perfectly so you can hear the sound of the puck is exactly. I think that's a more and get the fidelity perfect. I don't think that's a valuable use of. I think like, for example, when we talked about variability as a goalie, like shooting from all different angles, and that's hard practically, especially if you're the only coach there, like moving around. You can easily do that in VR, right? You could put 20 virtual coaches all shooting. So you can add more variability. You can get more kind of reps, more change the constraints easily and quickly. That's kind of what I've done in some of my research. So taking advantage of to do things that are practically not as easy, I think, and kind of knowing the limitations. Like you're never going to be able to practice controlling a rebound as a goalie in VR because the haptic proprioceptive feedback you get from a puck we can't simulate at all. We can simulate the visuals of being a goalie. But so moving around, cutting down the angle, things like that, probably there's going to be some advantages. But so I think, taking advantage of it to put in some of these things like variability and challenge a little easier. We could also, one of the things I've used it for is kind of adapting practice, right? So maybe as you get better, we increase the speed of the shots systematically as you make, and as it gets more difficult, we cut it back. So the things that are hard to do in real practice, that's what I try to focus on.
Yeah, that's, again, super interesting. It's kind of the same thing that we've discussed a lot on here too. One of the big things in any sport that, again, is like, again, perception action. So funny enough, the title of your podcast, right? Mm-hmm. But this idea of, again, in hockey, in baseball, any goaltending or response sport where you're picking up that visual information. So in this case, the way a shooter's body is orienting in space, the way that their stick is lined up, or in baseball, again, the angle of the pitcher's shoulder, their elbow, their wrist, where that ball is being released. Being able to learn from that is probably pretty valuable, right? Getting additional reps on that. The one question I've always had, and this is, again, what people ask me, but also I'm curious about, is how, since we know how valuable that type of information is, if say the VR doesn't mimic that super well, let's say that, again, you're seeing a puck coming at you, but you're not getting that same type of image from the way the virtual player's orienting their body or their stick. Is there potential drawbacks from a mislearning situation, or is this just going to be more variability in another way to look at it that's not going to have a negative transfer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on how kind of what the limitation is. If it's just not as good, then I think you're right. It's just gonna. But if there's some simple shortcut because of the way it, like, every time there's a slap shot, this thing happens, then right. the goalie's going to learn a strategy that's not going to transfer into the game. That can actually be like in baseball, we see this. when you're hitting off a pitching machine, you can see the ball coming down the chute, you can hear it, right? That hearing the ball come out, you can time your swing kind of. That you don't hear a ball come out like that when you bit up a real pitcher. So you can get kind of what's called negative transfer training. Your strategy you learn in practice doesn't work in the game. So yeah, I think if there was something like that, I would worry. But as long as it's kind of varying and doing enough different things, I think just different, adding variability, right?
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, for those listening who maybe aren't tuned into the baseball world as well, there's now pitching machines with full 4K LED displays that you can see and that have the pitcher's perfect release height, that have the pitcher's motion and the ball leaves. How cool are those things? Do I think they're cooler than they are? Or are they as cool as they sound?
No, they're pretty cool. There's one company, Traject, that they make them. They project it and the ball comes and they slide the thing back and forth. It's pretty amazing. So you can do batting practice off any particular pitcher you have video of happening. There are some limitations about, for example, like the pitcher's arm in the video how quickly they move doesn't change as they change different pitches, right? So it doesn't. There are some limitations, but it is pretty cool. Yeah.
When I first heard about it, I was like, this is pretty fantastic.
Yeah,
I mean,
it does. You can see the kind of intensity go up as you go from that to a regular machine. From a regular machine to that, I can see it in the players. Yeah.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's also banned during games, so people can't use it during game time. So you can't go take reps when a relief pitcher comes in, which I find pretty funny. Probably a reasonable rule, because again, advantages and whatnot. But I think again, that type of technology, when we think of, I guess, representativeness, that's pretty close for a pitching machine, right? That's probably almost close to being optimized for a pitching machine.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of the information, I think. You're right from the body and the flight of the ball for sure. It's getting much closer to game-like, definitely.
Yeah. So I think kind of the last and final thing I wanted to talk about, just because it ties in pretty nicely with this idea, we talked about positive transfer and negative transfer, right? So what type of practice is going to lead to positive results in a game? And like you just kind of mentioned, sometimes learning one style to be successful in one moment doesn't transfer well to another game. I think of an example in hockey when, a team is using a really linear, repetitive flow drill. So the player's coming down, shooting from the same spot over and over again. We're at least tired of that. So they stand 4 feet outside of their crease and they just get hit over and over again, which is something they probably can't get away with in a game, right? So in situations like that, I know this is probably the number one thing that I hear from parents in practice, and obviously some of the research I do is around practice design in hockey for goalies, and it's how do we address for that? In a weird way, the drill itself is constraining the learning of the goaltender because it's designed around more so the team, or at least what the coach thinks is for the team, rather than maybe for the goalie itself, for the goalies as part of that. Do you think that in those situations, one of the better approaches is to try and take one part of that drill and one thing that might positively transfer? So I mentioned before, sometimes in drills like that, I'll ask my goalie to stand really far back on their net and really force themselves to reach and extend and watch pucks longer because they're not as far out. Their net's bigger. That's one of my workarounds that I've used for drills like that, where it's like 40 or 50 shots from the same spot in a 4 or 5 minute time frame. I was kind of curious on what your thoughts on those are. Is in those situations, is it worth, further constraining maybe the goalie in that situation to try to get something out of it, or just try to minimize maybe negative transfer and bad habits from that non-representative type of drill that they get?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things. One, I'm sure you would agree. I don't think that drill's good for the offensive players either.
No, I think it's terrible, and it drives me crazy.
Big. So if we want to start, I've seen some of this good in basketball. Let's start with whatever you want, like a 3-on-2 or pick and roll, and then let the players decide after that. Then open it up to some creativity and making this. There's no decisions involved. You tell it. So let's start with that. It's bad, but yeah, I like what you're doing there. I think giving the goalie some constraints, making it start on different posts or like different positioning to give them a different, some variability in that, I think is probably the best thing you can do. You're kind of stuck in that situation with the same thing over and over. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the work that I kind of tried out, some of the work that I've done with my master's thesis was looking at even like technical perceived effort of drill types and different things for all players. And the thing that I think I noticed the most, and I see lots of different practices from teams of all ages, from university down to, 8 years old. That's kind of the realm that I work in. And to see just how linear so much of practice is, right? Where it's like, go here, then go here, then go here, which is never existing in a game situation, especially in sports that are sports in parallel, like soccer or hockey, right? Where there's constant motion, there's not set starting points, or there's rare set starting points, right? I find that to be something that we don't, I guess maybe on a coaching lens, we don't talk about enough, is the cognitive learning demands of variability in drills and make this pass, then make this pass and skate here. There's, you said, there's no decision making, which is one of the biggest components of learning, is
For sure.
right. So I always struggle with that. And I think that at least what I've been trying to do for the past little while is that's my recommendation, is create more options, force more decision making in your drill types, as my one general suggestion to coaches. If you had one general suggestion, that's my general one, is make people think more and make the cognitive challenge match what the cognitive demands are in games.
I think, you said it earlier, the perception action, and we want your movements and your decisions and to be driven by what's happening in front of you, not what a coach told you. That's when athletes are going to perform the best. My son was playing basketball earlier this year, and the coach was trying to put in a new play, and he was telling, you go here, you set a screen there, and they could never remember because it was meaningless. It was just a dance. It was choreography, right? You told them, I want you to cut that defender off. That's why you're going here.
Yeah.
And so much of it is unopposed too, right? They're practicing it, putting it with no defense there. But you want them to learn things based on what they see the defense is doing to them. So that's kind of the biggest thing. Yeah, I agree with you. There's so much of it is it's so much demanding, and kids are not going to remember where you tell them to go. But if you told them, I want you to take that defender out that's covering the guy with the puck, then they understand, right?
Yeah.
I tried to watch them learn screens, and they're setting on the wrong side, and because they don't understand what they're supposed to accomplish, right? Right. Yeah,
absolutely. As a goalie, as a coach, as a young researcher, the number one bane of my existence is the 5-on-0 power play drill in hockey.
Yeah,
where the goalie's stuck again 5-on-0. The team is in theory practicing the play they want for their power play, except now they have infinite ways of making that play happen.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that 5-on-0 power play looks so good in practice. Like it's dynamite. Why don't we score more in games? Right?
Yeah.
And again, it's not to make fun of anyone. That's the way that I grew up learning. That's the way that when I first coached, that's how I thought too, because okay, we have to do it like this. Once we get it perfect like this, then we can add one defender. Or the funny juxtaposition is we practice 5-on-0 from the get-go, no constraints, and then right to 5-on-4. And so now we've made this enormous leap. And now the learning they've just made on that 5-on-0, that's going to have a tough time transferring, because the information, like you said, is just not there anymore, right? It's completely different. So
I'd much rather, we want to learn when you could pass when there's this much space, like you shoot, drive when that's what you learn. But from the start, rather than a pass because the coach said when they get the puck.
Right.
So again, it's going back to that, parents getting frustrated because letting go of the control of the coach, that they know the best thing to do all the time, right?
Yeah.
Kind of letting athletes just have more autonomy in making those decisions.
And it's tough. I guess the last thing I'll say, and I know that you've spoken on this a bunch, is it's also tough because on one lens, people say, well, why don't you just let them play all the time then too, right? We know that's not the best learning either, right? Like if it was just let them do whatever, then we would just let people scrimmage 5-on-5 in hockey or 5-on-5 in basketball the whole time. And we would assume that would teach them the best. And while there's definitely a time and place for scrimmaging and what I call competition replication, direct competition replication, that's not always going to promote learning either. So there has to be a healthy balance of, like you said, bunch representative enough, but not just letting absolute just full play scrimmage going on, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think goalie is a good example. You could have long time where you're getting no shots, you're getting no opportunity, you're not practicing. Also, I think, more and more we're kind of recognizing, we all know this, you have to coach to an individual. Like you want to coach to what does a goalie need to work on? Controlling rebounds, saving screenshots, whatever it is.
Right.
We want to kind of create more reps of those those kind of situations in practice, then they might get in the game. They might only get one of them and it goes in and they,
Right.
So you want to kind of maximize that in practice. That's why we don't want to just always let them play. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a great example, right? Where
And then, and adding the constraints too, like the constraints are going to kind of enhance and let them explore that. We can't put that same constraint in the game.
right.
Tell your team before the game, you're not allowed to make backhand passes this game. No, I'm not going to do that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I played for a coach in college who would kick players off for making a backhand pass in the neutral zone. That was the constraint. If you made that,
okay,
there's some of that, which again, I think is a pretty severe consequence.
Yeah,
because sometimes the backhand pass is the right play. So
sure.
right,
yeah.
So like there's give and there's take, and it's complicated, and that's what makes it hard, and that's what makes coaching hard. But that's what hopefully with some more information, coaches can start trying things and coaches can start adapting things. And I think we're making pretty significant progress, albeit sometimes slow progress.
Yeah,
right?
for sure. I think it's and it's a kind of a fun way to coach. I think if you really get into it, I think for kids, it really, empowers them a little bit, makes it a bit more fun. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. So this has all been wonderful. And then so I'm weary of time as always. And so I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time. Now, as all podcasts do, this is your chance to market and why everyone should buy your books and why they should read them, why they should listen to your podcast, which are all things that people listening should do. So if people want to find more information from you, some of your work, your information on your podcast, your website, now would be a great time to kind of pass that along.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'll keep it fairly short. So everything you can find out about me is I have a website called perceptionaction.com that covers, as my podcast, Perception Action Podcast, which is a weekly podcast that kind of covers a lot of this research in this area. And the book that kind of covers this new approach to coaching we've been talking about, constraints-led approach, is called How We Learn to Move. That's kind of the book. So it's all there. You just perceptionaction.com. One-stop shopping. Yeah.
It's a website that I use as well. There's lots of information. There's scientific articles for those people who I never listen to the show and are always curious about the science behind it. There's lots of good resources that are linked on that website too. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been wonderful. This heavily feeds my biases, so I'm no longer going to challenge any of my own thoughts now that they've been reinforced. So again, thank you very much, and I appreciate you having me on today.
Well, my pleasure, Jim. And I really enjoyed it.